Hi, everybody, and a warm welcome to our event Superpowers Reloaded. Together with Future Academy X, we created this event series for all founders and innovators and actually all people who want to develop their personal skills. I'm Franziska, the head of marketing at Wayra, and why is this topic so important to us? Markus, can you click to the next slide, please?
Oh, sorry.
Don't worry. Okay, so why is this topic so important to us? Our main goal at Wayra actually is to connect startups with our mother company, Telefonica. We do that with paid pilot projects for the startups and or investments. Besides that, we have a big community of around 70 people, all sitting with us in the office in the heart of Munich. For example, Anja, she's here today joining us, and Markus. Therefore, we work with a wide range of people, founders, corporates, freelancers, and they all have different motivations and mindsets. Especially during the last months, we noticed how important it is to quickly adapt to the world around us and keep this responsive mindset. So I'm super happy to have Markus here with me today, the CEO and co-founder of Future Academy X, and he is part of our Wayra community. His team developed a framework of the core competencies of the 21st century. While he will guide you through today's session, I'm actually in the back supporting him with a smooth run-through. So over to you for now.
Yes, thank you very much, Franziska. Can everybody hear me okay? Good. Franziska already talked briefly about the superpowers of the 21st century. We are the Future Academy X. And like Franziska just alluded to, we kind of were developing this framework around the superpowers based on a need we saw in the market, which is our feeling was that our school system, universities, even adult education in businesses is really old school. And it's kind of, if you are a little bit familiar with our education system, it's about 150 years old. So kids would still sit like they used to do in the old Prussian schools. The problem is that at the time, we were really educating potential soldiers and factory workers. But today, we obviously require quite different skills or additional skills that are important. And this is where we came up with this framework. And the 4 superpowers essentially will be kind of the framework that we're using also for the different webinars that we will be running. And the first one today is something that I'm specifically excited about because it's very close to my heart, and I've done a lot with it in my own experience as a founder, but just as a person. And this is really responsive mindset. Now, why is that important today? Not just in Corona times, but also in general, where our life is becoming more and more complex and difficult. And so it's particularly important in difficult times to be able to ground yourself, to be strong when everything around you seems to be falling apart, and really sort of hold a clear view on where you want to go. Because if not, then you may take the wrong decisions. And there's a whole range of tools that we also will be discussing today that you can use in order to stay that grounded. Now, I have to say, by no means am I a complete expert. I'm sure there's other people in the audience today, and I would love to hear from you later, because I've sort of entered my own personal development journey, and this worked for me, but it doesn't necessarily mean it works for everybody else. So I'm keen also in the Q&A later, and we have some interactive sessions to hear from you guys what your experiences were. So that's responsive mindset. The second one is around team intelligence. Now, I'm sure you would agree, it doesn't matter whether you are a startup or whether you're a large corporate. Whenever you enter the realm of people, there's going to be politics. Because people have different needs and they don't talk to each other, there are conflicts and all sorts of struggles going on. And so we are working very closely with a group called Neuropower in Australia, who have developed a whole framework on what they call the 6 social cognitive needs of the human brain, which is neuroscience-based, really interesting stuff. And that's going to be our second webinar. I believe it's on the 3rd of August. And the third one is also highly important for startups, but also innovators in companies. We call this execution power. And I think you would agree, especially as a founder, that this is a really important skill to have. Now, it's important to remember that sometimes we as Germans, and I believe there's a lot of Germans in the audience, believe that we are great thinkers, we are great philosophers, we've got really good engineers, but sometimes what we're lacking is really bringing those ideas to fruition. And that's where a lot of the sort of new skills which and the lean startup movement come in, where you can use tools like design thinking or the business model canvases in order to get very quickly from theory to action or to prototype. The fourth superpower then is digital fitness. And this is also something I often see talks about digitization, and they're super abstract and very not deep, I think. And I find digital fitness something really pragmatic and tangible, and something really creative that you can, there's lots of tools, you can prototype apps. There's so much stuff you can do if you really let yourself emerge into this world. So these are going to be the 4 superpowers that are we're going to use for as a framework for the webinar series. Now, let's get right into it. One thing I want to say also is maybe a couple of words to myself. I've got an agency and consulting background. I used to live for 10 years in Australia and also in the Silicon Valley. And it's funny because when I was living in Australia, I always loved studying on the side. I did this really strange and weird degree, which is called somatic psychotherapy. And I know it sounds a little bit woo-woo, but trust me, it was really cool. It was kind of a combination of Western psychology and Eastern philosophy, if you like. And it says somatic already in the title because we understand today that we are not just up here, but there's actually a whole body that also can take in emotions and different ways of perception. And in fact, we know today that often when kids experience trauma really early on in their lives, when they don't even have language to express anything yet, a lot of this stuff gets somehow manifested. And we work with different tools to actually help them release some of this stress. It's a really interesting area, still relatively new, but I believe that's also a big trend in psychology. So this is basically my background. I'm not a practicing psychotherapist or anything like this. I did it more because I was really interested in it and maybe used it also for my own personal development journey. Now, I believe you've seen images like this before. Needless to say that for us, it's been a really difficult time recently. In fact, I would say about 85% of our business was killed by COVID-19. And since we are running face-to-face workshops and events, you can imagine how bad this has hit us. So I don't know about you guys, but I often think, Jesus, how are we going to cope with this? There's a lot of existential angst going on. I ask myself this question every morning I wake up. I think, should we change our business model? What does that mean in terms of my personal finances? How am I going to continue and keep going on in a world that seems to be falling apart and where you have so much uncertainty? Now, this is where we enter the entrepreneur's dilemma. And it's interesting because actually, if you're already running your own business, what we are currently experiencing is not completely unfamiliar. And I'm sure some of you would know exactly what I'm talking about when you see this slide. Because in fact, once you've decided to become an entrepreneur, this is kind of your life. It's like a roller coaster. I often call it the bipolarity of a startup because there's so many ups and downs that you go through that it's really difficult to navigate and manage. And in fact, sometimes it's like this, where you think we've just landed this great deal, it's a sales deal, and you think you're making all the money in the world, and this is going to be the next big startup. And then even maybe on the same day in the afternoon, something happens that makes you want to hide in this bucket. So it is difficult, and I think it's important that as we start entering the entrepreneurial path, it's also the road less traveled. And this really means that a lot of people might not be able to relate to you and really understand what you're going through. It's only really 10% of the working population that are in some shape or form self-employed. So it's a hard road. It's got a lot of difficult barriers on the way, and you have to somehow manage to deal with this. And one could really ask, and I think I've asked myself this question a lot of times, why in hell would we ever do something like this? Initially, there's little money, there's so much stress, you don't know where this thing is going. And if you look at the motivation for launching a startup, there's all sorts of different reasons. And interestingly, and maybe you guessed this, but money does not seem to be the main driver for people launching their own business. It will play a role, of course, but you can see it's further down. It's actually the last one in the list. What's more interesting to people seems to be to realize their own business idea, the enthusiasm, the passion that they've got for this thing, having responsibility for their own success, being their own boss. All this stuff seems to be playing a lot bigger and more important role. Now, and this is my personal opinion, I believe there's something more subtle and bigger going on behind the scenes. And if you look at those reasons, they are kind of the obvious reasons that you would state. But I think behind those top features or top reasons is one feature that really drives us as human beings. And I think this is, you could watch it if you go 300, 400 years into the past. You could see it in some of the pioneers who were exploring new territory. Why were they doing this? I mean, the success likelihood was extremely low, but they still were going for it. And part of this reason is, of course, because they felt like I can now explore new territories, but I also can go beyond my own limits and boundaries and can grow as a person. So personal growth for me is a big driver for becoming an entrepreneur, and you might not necessarily have this in your mind when you first started. There's a lady called Brené Brown that some of you may have heard about, and she is a TED speaker. She's also written a book called Rising Strong. If you haven't checked it out, her TED Talk on vulnerability, I highly recommend it. She's of a woman and very funny at the same time, but really clear, strong woman that has gone through a lot of ups and downs in her life. And I love this quote because, I mean, essentially what she's saying is there's two options in life. One is you sit in the audience, you watch from the sidelines what's going on, and you know, you may have a semi-comfortable life, and that's fine. Everybody chooses their own life. There's no judgment or anything. It's just you have to make the decision. The second part is you are in the audience, and like she says so beautifully, you get your ass kicked. It's super difficult. You're going to have so many challenges. But one good thing that you will get out of this is really growing as a person. And so I think, even if you don't make any money, I think almost every or most of the founders I've spoken to, even if they went bust, they always say, well, the one thing that I could take away from this was as a person I've grown to be somebody different. A beautiful, beautiful representation or manifestation of this is this lady called Katja. Katja used to be one of our speakers in our first events. Year of the Goat, it was called, in 2015, and we did this one in Frankfurt, and I chose her because she's Russian national. That was not the reason why I chose her, but she also actually won the Olympic gold medal in synchronized swimming, and it really puzzled me. I always think, how do people get to this? And so I asked her in an interview before, I said, Katja, how were you able to pull this off? I mean, winning the gold medal, this is in any discipline, that's an outstanding achievement. How did you actually do it? And she said, you know, it was so interesting because initially I didn't feel, I wasn't the most talented person. There were a lot more girls that were more capable than me. They were better than me. But then maybe around the age of 15, 16, something happened. Some of them started to become interested in perhaps some boys, or they started moving away, whatever the reasons were, but they got distracted. And she just kept swimming, like she says so beautifully on the slide. She didn't give up. She had the discipline to persevere. And eventually she held this gold medal in her hand, but it was a lot of this long-term commitment. Angela Lee Duckworth, who's a professor at the University of Psychology in Pennsylvania, she once described it as grit. If you haven't heard this word, it's not used so commonly in German. Well, frankly, there's no direct translation for it. So if you want to translate it, it's probably the combination of perseverance and passion, enthusiasm. And I believe this is kind of the muscle that we really need to build. Now, this is all great and stuff, but let's face it, responsive mindset, great. This is all a little bit abstract. I mean, how the hell are you ever going to develop this? How do you make this more pragmatic and practical? Now, of course, you could do this and just read some self-help books. There's, it's a growing industry. If you go into a bookshop, they get bigger and bigger. And I have read some of these books, and I think they are good, and they provide you with a really good inspiration initially. I don't think, of course, they are enough, because ultimately it's just information that you take in, and if you don't do anything with it, then it's not going anywhere. For me, and this is a very personal experience, the main thing that I felt helped me to personally transform was really to face what I would call my inner demons. And this sounds strange in a way, but it's kind of looking at the stuff that you really don't want to look at. And I want to give you an example. When I was living in Australia, I went through a really difficult period where my relationship fell apart. It's the classical stuff, right? So job, I wasn't happy. I wanted to come back to Europe. I wasn't happy anymore in Sydney, and all this stuff happened, and I went into a deep depression. And that lasted for, I don't know how long, maybe a couple of months. And I was lucky that at the time I had a really good friend of mine who became my mentor. And when I was at the deepest of these points, he would say something to me that initially hurt and was really painful, but it kind of did something. And this something was to do with, I think, letting go of parts of my personal identity. So it's got something to do with how you are at a certain point in time, which limits you from growing. But the problem is, because it's part of our identity, it's so difficult to let go. But the interesting thing was, while he was talking, something was crunching, like my whole body was doing something. So I felt intuitively he said the right thing. But the problem was that I just couldn't take it. I remember that day when I went back home, went to bed, slept actually well. I was exhausted, emotionally drained. And the next morning I woke up and something had shifted in my mind, where I thought, well, actually, I could let these things go. It's possible. I can't tell you exactly what happened, because sometimes in dreams and in sleeping states, our brain starts doing something that we're not even fully aware of. But that was kind of, for me, a real turning point, where I felt now I could move forward. So I know this is getting a little bit deep. I just want to use this quote because it beautifully expresses it. So James Baldwin said, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." And this could not be closer to the truth. So I've talked a lot now, and I would love for us now to do a little breakout session, and Franziska is going to manage or basically lead you through it. But what I would like you to do, there's going to be a maximum of 3 people per each breakout session. First of all, if you don't know each other, introduce yourself quickly, but quickly if possible. Remember that we only have now 10 minutes, so it's important that you let the other people talk as well. And talk briefly about what are some of the biggest challenges you're currently struggling with. And I know this can get very deep very quickly, and we only have 10 minutes, but try to get to it if you can. And then you're going to get a notice from Franziska, who will then call you back in. So 10 minutes time, Franziska, over to you. So let's talk about the art of growth. Now again, look, I'm just a sample size of one. Not that I have any idea about anything. But I can share my own personal experiences and maybe the sort of stuff that resonated with me personally. First of all, I want to start off for the psychologists of you out there. Would I'd be interested? I mean, so the thing is, there's a lot of theories, especially when we talk about developmental psychology. So you can see stuff like this. So there's Piaget, there's Erickson. The problem with many of these theories is that I find, at least, the majority of them focuses on what I would call child or maybe adolescent development. But many of them don't really go a lot beyond the sort of first 20 years of your life. Now, we could say that adults are just kids with money, right? If this is the kind of thing you subscribe to, well, good on you. Move on. I don't personally believe this. I think there's so much room and so much potential for growth as we start turning older and older, well into your 70s probably, until you start acting like a kid again. Then it gets harder. So if you believe that and if you subscribe to that, then of course the question is, what does it actually mean to be an adult? And what I would like to do with you very briefly now is switch to Menti. If you can switch to menti.com, you see the code here, 400992. And if you could just free float whatever you think it means to be an adult. And I'm not talking about divorce or marriage or mortgages and houses, but the more subtle stuff that you believe could make you an adult. Just fire away. I'm just switching briefly. So here, I hope now we can see what you guys are writing. If this, sometimes Menti just causes us trouble. If it doesn't work, we'll do it in the chat. But let's try here first. So you can also do it from your mobile, desktop, your browser, whatever. Thinking of buying a flat, self-responsibility, very good. What else do we have? Get your topics organized. Paying bills. Oh yeah, the bills. Is that it? There must be more than that, surely. Taking care of parents, yes, very good. Be self-aware. Yes, I like that one. Cleaning home. Time-driven. Yes, the most important resource is time. I think we would all agree. Remember good old times when you were younger. Okay, that's also a view. What else do we have? Not partying all night. Very good. Understand the difference. Very good. So I'll switch again. Now I've come up with my own that I liked. It's, for me, being an adult is also being socially mature. That means that you can hold difficult conversations, that you can actually hold conflict, and it's okay to have that conflict. It's gaining wisdom, which is, I think, something that all would agree is something you can only acquire after years. It's kind of an underlying intuition to take the right decisions. Self-awareness, we've heard this before. Independent sense of self, we'll talk about this more. But also the ability to hold ambiguity. So that means, the church and the Catholic religion would always tell us, put us in these buckets of black and white. As you start entering more complex territories, you realize that this doesn't really work so well anymore. So sometimes, the most obvious choice is not always the right choice. There's a really good, if you're interested, a good stream of thinking, which is called behavioral economics. Daniel Kahneman is the lead in this. He's also won the Nobel Prize for this, and he talks about system 1 and system 2 in our brain, and how system 1 is the emotional brain, and that always wants to do the obvious stuff that doesn't cost a lot of resources, and system 2 is it's what makes us human, and also maybe a little bit wiser. And they're in constant fight with each other, and often you see people around you or yourself going into the system 1 and making really stupid decisions. And so that happens. I mean, that's part of us, but it's a good idea to not give into this, but hold this ambiguity and try to navigate complexity. And I was just putting in as a question mark, just like Obama, because for me, he's sort of represented this in a lot of ways, unlike our current American president. Good. So now again, how the hell are we going to get there? This is a very good question. Now, before we just look at the time. So before we move into, I've got some very practical tips for you, which I have right at the end. Before we do this, let me very briefly introduce you to somebody I really personally relate to. A guy is called Robert Keane. He's a professor, or he used to be a professor of psychology, I believe at Harvard University, and he's written this book called The Evolving Self. He looks very cheerful, doesn't he? He's a very happy guy. And he, yeah, I don't know, somehow when I started reading his stuff, it made a lot of things started making a lot of sense. Now, let me just say there's a little bit of theory. I promise it's not going to be too much. Sometimes theory can be really helpful to understand your current situation well. So that's why I'm briefly going through with you. Before we dive deeper into Mr. Keegan, let me just explain to you two key concepts which are really important to understand in order to understand him. The first one we've already briefly alluded to is transformation. The second one is what he calls subject-object shift. I know it sounds very abstract. I promise it's actually quite simple. Now, the transformation myth, that's what he says, is often we tend to think about transformation, we just add more skills. It's just we've got this bucket full of information and skills and knowledge we've got, and we just add more into it, and then we're transformed. Of course, like I've alluded to earlier, this is probably not how it works. Actually, what he says is transformation is by looking at something with an entirely new lens. Let me give you an example. So have you ever had this situation where as a child or as an adolescent or as whatever age you've read a book, and then maybe a few years later you've read exactly the same book, and there were so many different and more and new nuggets in this and understanding that you just couldn't possibly have earlier. So something must have shifted, because maybe I mean, obviously the book is still the same, but it's kind of looking at the world because something inside of you has shifted, and that's what he believes transformation is. You could do the same with movies. The Matrix always does that to me. Every time I watch it, something else seems to come up or pop up. So that's transformation. The second one I think is even more important. I really struggle to put this into words and sort of summarize it in a way so everybody can relate to it. But typically we are in this sort of subjective state of mind. So we're in our experience, we look at things, and it's almost like things happen to us. What he's arguing for is that we should move from the subject to an object perspective, where we start looking at ourselves with entirely different eyes. It's a bit like this, what you see on the image. You can't read the label of the jar you're in. So you kind of need to take a step back in order to do this. For those of you who are like Buddhist philosophy, that's the detachment. So really being out of something. Good example would be your emotions. When we say, I am angry, that sounds an awful like you are kind of attached to this as an identity of you, but actually you're just angry in that very moment. So rather than saying I am angry, it's like I feel angry because you've done such and such, whatever it is. So that kind of shift to understand that these things are not really part of our identity, but they can be changed and shifted, and they're just maybe a temporary state that sits in us. So that's the subject-object shift. Now, he also talks about 5 stages of adult development. I mean, they all have stages. The first 2 are more related to younger people or adolescents, kids. It's really, I think, the most interesting one in this context is stage 3 and stage 4, and you can see how many people he believes are in those stages. And let's just briefly go through them. The first, maybe the second stage I'll start with, because you all can relate to it. It's what they call the Imperial Mind. So adolescents usually are at the stage where it's all about them. They're so important, and their needs are the very first thing that needs to come, and everything else is after. So they also use other people sometimes as a means to an end, but they need to go through this phase of their lives in order to find what they would call the true identity. Interestingly, if people in this stage are in a relationship and they cheat, they don't do it because they truly believe it's the right thing to do, but it's kind of fear of consequences. That's the main thing. Again, it's about them. Interestingly, if you look at some people even much older, they are still at that stage. I want to give you a brief example of somebody, a friend of mine I had at high school, who was this, he had all the potential, you know, attractive guy, intelligent, sporty, he was the spokesman of the class. So everybody loved him. But something happened when he entered university. He started studying sports and teaching, and all of a sudden he sort of got caught up in this identity of being forever a student, drinking, partying, chasing girls, all this stuff. And for some reason, he could not get out of this thing anymore. And if you look at him today, you see a teenager mind in the body of a grown-up. And so it's really awkward, but I'm sure you all can relate to this and see how sometimes people can get stuck in that imperial mind stage. Once you move out of the very self and ego-focused area, then you come to what's called the socialized mind. Robert Kegan believes there's about 58% of the population. That's when you start understanding really there's more stuff around you that's important, culture, ideas, family, systems, all this sort of stuff. And you start shifting your perspective from internal to external. So you understand that life is just not about yourself, but about other people. The danger with this is that you might move from, you might kind of look for constant external validation. And so you don't want to get stuck in this forever either, but actually part of the adult growth is to move into what he calls the self-authoring mind, where you write your own story. And I think this is so relevant for if you want to be an intrapreneur or an entrepreneur, is really sort of starting to take charge of your own destiny, where you're not defined by what other people want you to do, but you can make a clear distinction between other needs and your own, and then make clear decisions. So that's the self-authoring mind. These are the main stages. Very briefly, before I wrap up, I would like to introduce you to my own personal tools for growth that I've been using a lot in the past. The first one was a book I read, and that really helped me in this really difficult phase of mine, which is called Transitions. And in there, they talk about how there's 3 stages when you go through it. There's endings, where you have a lot of resistance to change. You don't really want to go anywhere because you still want to stick to this old stuff. I think even more interesting is phase 2 is the neutral zone, which I feel like a lot of the world is in at the moment, where you've kind of have partly let go of the old world, but you don't really know what's coming, and you're lost in Neverland somewhere, and you're still trying to find your means. So you've got a lot of resistance, usually you've got low moral and productivity. And then after this phase, usually what you find is new beginnings. Now, this is again a little bit of theory, but it helps, I think, to put things into context and really help you to move through difficult times. Then 2 or 3 is really to find a friend who truly understands your pain. And these are entrepreneurs also who basically can completely understand what pain you're going through and empathize with you. The 4th tool I find really relevant as founders, or if you have a team. Often we find that there's conflict and communication doesn't flow anymore. I had this with my co-founder last year, and everything seemed to be falling apart between us. And I took a tool which a friend of mine gave to me and said, well, just set up a session of 30 minutes a day for maybe a few weeks and see how you go. And you will not believe how these daily sessions helped us really to resolve. Within the first 3 sessions even, we already were on a very different state. We just empathetic to the other person's needs, and it seemed to somehow do the magic. And the final one is meditation, and that's simply because I like to do this. It really helps me a lot to calm down. I've got skipped the first one, which is a morning routine. So this is part of my daily morning routine that I go through from 6 to 7, and is a great tool. And there's all sorts of meditation forms that you can choose and pick. So that is it. I've already gotten some hints from Franziska that I need to rush on, and so we've got 4 minutes left. So this is really the time to basically have some Q&As, and I encourage you to ask questions to me or post any statements in the chat. Franziska, how are we going to do this?
So actually, I would just open the talk for questions. If you have some, you can post them in the chat or ask directly. what you prefer. I also opened another poll just to hear feedback on the session today. So yes, it's up to you. Yes, thanks for joining, Elisabeth. Sounds good. Maybe we can switch to the last slide, just to give you some heads up also for the next session.
Oh, this one. Yeah. So yeah, I've briefly mentioned this in the intro. So this is the next webinar we're going to be running. It's based on this neuroscientific framework. They call it the 6 drivers of human behavior. So we run through those. And again, it's going to be between 10 and 11, Monday, 3rd of August. So you can see the link here. We're also going to send it to you afterwards. So if you can take a picture now, or alternatively, you can just wait until the email comes through to you. Cool. Then let's do a final brief checkout.
I have a question.
Yes, okay. Of course, go.
Hi, Marcus. I'm Urs. Thanks for the session and very interesting stuff. And I would like, as we talked about in the breakout session, about our challenges and struggles, and talking about this first superpower, which part of your superpower is the one you currently need most, or is the most challenging one to keep up in the current situation?
I think definitely responsive mindset. Like I mentioned, when I wake up in the morning, usually the monkey mind starts to rattle, and you know how we come up with all these scenarios why something is falling apart and it's difficult. And if you let this happen, then of course, you know, it's very difficult, especially if you want to stay motivated and productive. And so that's where really it's interesting, because meditation, also the morning routine that I have every morning between 6 and 7, what it really does, I mean, you can listen to Tim Ferriss, he will say similar things, but I think it's not that the morning routines that you apply necessarily make you successful. It's more that when you are down in the dumps, when things are difficult like it is now, it's like an anchor that you can hold on to, that can help you really to look forward to. And it's now become part of my daily routine, and I feel so much different once, even when the monkey mind starts in the morning. I know I will go into this my own morning routine, and things will start looking a little bit brighter. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, yes. One small follow-up. So you build your really around your morning routine. So there's nothing like which can move your morning routine, or?
Yeah, it is. So it's important that when you start out, because as we know, especially when you start doing meditation, or like I then also do yoga and cold showering, that you start off really enthusiastically. It's a little bit like, you know, 1st of January, you decide you go to the gym, and 5 days later, nothing. So I think it's extremely important to understand how routines work. And so if you don't feel up to the task because you feel hungover or sick or whatever is going on, commit to 5 minutes. Even like I do 60 minutes usually. Didn't feel well at the beginning, I just did 5 minutes. So at least your body knows that this is what you're going to do. And eventually, I mean, there's different theories, but eventually after 50 to 60 days, you usually find that this has become a little bit like brushing your teeth. And you need to go through this phase in order to keep it up. And what I find now is that when I don't have it, I mean, there's other tricks, like I use incense when I do meditation, and then I remember, my brain remembers this nice smell, and then it wants to go back to whatever is associated with the meditation. So there's different things you can do to make sure you're not going to give up on it. But now it's kind of part of my life. But of course, sometimes it can happen that I will have a business meeting and I have to or go somewhere where I won't have time. But I would say 6 out of 7 days.
Cool. Thank you for sharing.
Pleasure.
Okay. Then thanks a lot for your time. joining us today. Yeah, we're super excited to host 4 more webinars each month. If you have any questions, feel free to contact us. And yes, hopefully see you next time.